Hey guys, what's up? My name is Sky Webb and I'm here to talk about a true crime story that I cannot get off my mind. But before I get started, I just want to put out a little disclaimer. There mean no harm to any of the victims or the victims' families, and I wish everyone who's hurt within this story the utmost peace and solace either in rest or in recovery. With that out of the way, happy True Crime Thursday. I'm so glad you clicked on this video. I hope you enjoy it enough to give it a like or comment or subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Today we're going to look into the Barbie and Ken Killers. The Barbie and Ken Killers were also known as Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo, and they were husband and wife, rapists and murderers. Karla was born on the 4th of May 1970 in Ontario, Canada, and Paul was born on the 27th of August 1964 in Toronto, Canada. So Paul was born into a fairly wealthy family, but that family was also fairly dysfunctional. Paul's dad was very abusive to all of his partners and all of his wives, and that included Paul's mother. And that's something that he grew up with, witnessing this all the time, day in and day out. And then when Paul was 15 years old, he actually discovered that this person who he believed to be his dad wasn't actually his dad. His mother had actually fallen pregnant to an ex-boyfriend and had the child, which was Paul, and raised him believing that this other man was actually his dad. So both the mum and the dad had lied to Paul his entire life, and he took this pretty hard when he found out, because despite this man being quite abusive, he was still the one that was always there for them and was there for them financially and always gave them a roof over their head. And he just found that news really shocking because he never had to do any of that, but he did it anyway. And so now Paul had very mixed feelings towards this man. Paul went on to go to college and seemed to come out of that childhood fairly normal. He had tons of girlfriends, he had tons of friends. He was a very charismatic sort of guy. He was very good looking. He was very charming, a lot of people would say, but a lot of his girlfriends and he would break up fairly quickly after they got together because of signs of abuse on Paul's end. So he would show a lot of abusive characteristics, and he would find himself in a lot of DV, domestic violence situations, and always wound up single after dating all these women. As for Karla, her upbringing was fairly normal, fairly standard. There's not a ton of information about her, so there's really not a lot to say. There was a couple of instances where there was just weird stories about her childhood when she was like 8 or 9 years old, and they didn't have a lot of context, so I don't know how true they are or how much substance there is to them, but I thought it would be worth adding. There was one story that when Karla was about 8 or 9, she took her friend's guinea pig or hamster, I'm not sure which, and she put it in a pillowcase and then threw the pillowcase out of a window. So some people thought she did this to like see if it could fly with like a parachute or something along those lines. But a lot of people said she just did it because she just wanted to see what would happen and how it would die. And so obviously the hamster did die. And then when it did die, they, buried it and gave it a little funeral. That was an accident. But then a couple of weeks after they had buried the hamster, she wanted to go dig it up so that she could see what its dead body would look like after it had like decomposed. So again, I don't know how much truth there is to that, but I just thought it would be worth adding. So in 1987, the couple met for the first time in a restaurant, and they had like an instant connection, an instant bond. They were super attracted to each other. They got along super well. They were talking all night. They stayed there all night talking to each other. But at this point, Paul was 23 years old and Karla was only 17. So the two got involved with each other, but just like all of Paul's past girlfriends, he started to show these abusive characteristics and signs within the relationship. But unlike all of his past relationships, Karla didn't leave because she actually liked these abusive traits that Paul exhibited, and she actually would encourage these terrible, horrible domestic violence, abusive traits because she enjoyed it. They also discovered that they had very similar sexual interests. They were both very sadomasochistic. They had very similar sexual fantasies, and a lot of these things that they would do together or that they would talk about doing together was very hard to find elsewhere because it was so dark. They very quickly developed like a power dynamic role where Paul was considered to be the master or the king of the relationship, and Karla was referred to as the slave. And then Paul even asked Karla would it be alright, or is it alright if I was a rapist? And Karla was like, yeah, that's cool, that's hot, I'm okay with that. In November of 1987, just around 2 months after they had met for the very first time, Paul actually asked Karla to marry him, and Karla happily said yes, and just like that, they were engaged. Now at this point, Paul had actually sexually assaulted multiple different women. He had actually raped a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old, and he had attempted to rape 2 other women, and Karla knew about this. She was fine with it. She thought that it was hot. It sort of aligned with her own sexual fantasies, and so now that they were engaged, she gave him permission to go out and do it some more. So at this point, Paul's string of rapes had been reported, and the police and the media had actually dubbed, the perpetrator of these rapes as the Scarborough rapist. But they didn't yet know that this was Paul. Nobody knew that this was Paul. So Paul was technically the Scarborough rapist, but nobody knew it. So Paul attacked someone again in December, and this victim actually gave a really detailed description of what Paul looked like. And the sketch artist was able to do a sketch that was spitting image of Paul. It was very clearly, obviously Paul, but unfortunately that sketch wasn't released to the public until 2 years later. But when it was finally released to the public, almost instantly, Paul's friends actually recognized him in this sketch and went straight to the police. They weren't trying to protect him by any means. They went straight to the police and said, this is Paul. It is spitting image of Paul. And so the police talked to Paul. They questioned him about his whereabouts and about these rapes and, such and such. And they asked him for DNA samples, which he gave to them really easily, no dramas. He gave them a saliva sample and a blood sample. But the problem was that despite these being sent off pretty much immediately for testing, they had acquired quite a number of DNA samples from quite a number of other people. So they were all sent off immediately, and so it actually took a very long time for the DNA to be tested, which is a real shame. So while these DNA samples were off for testing, Karla and Paul decided that they were going to move towns. They were going to move to a place called St. Catherine's and move in with Karla's family. They decided they were going to stay with Karla's family just for a short amount of time while they saved a little bit of money, and then they were going to go out and buy their own place. And that was absolutely fine with Karla's family because they loved him. He was a really charismatic man. He was very charming. He was very easy to get along with. People loved to talk to him. He was very good at making people feel special and, asking questions, and just very manipulative when you look back in hindsight. But they loved him, and so they had no issue. And it was actually Karla's little younger sister who loved Paul the most. She absolutely adored him. She really looked up to him. She loved getting attention for him. He made her feel really special. She just thought he was really cool. Paul took a huge liking to her younger sister as well, and the primary reason for this was because she was still a virgin, and Paul had a massive obsession with virgins. He really wanted to take people's virginities, and this became a very big obsession of his. This was especially hard for Karla to deal with because she felt like no matter what she did for Paul, no matter what she gave him, no matter how well she performed, no matter what they tried in the bedroom, she would never be able to give him a virginity because she obviously didn't have hers anymore, and it's not something you can give twice. So as a way to try and combat the fact that she couldn't give this to him, she tried to do everything in her power to make him happy, and that included giving him access to her younger sister Tammy. And so what she would do is leave windows open or doors open or blinds open so that he could actually watch Tammy while she got dressed, while she got undressed, while she showered, things along that nature. And that was her way of giving him something that normally she couldn't. So she'd allow Paul to pleasure himself while watching her younger sister. Karla still didn't think that that was good enough, and she still didn't feel adequate for Paul at this point in time. So in 1990, she devised a plan to steal some supplies from her work, which she worked at a vet clinic, and she decided that she would steal some supplies to sedate her sister and give her to Paul as a present. She was going to give him her virginity. So one night in December, Karla laced Tammy's drink with one of the drugs that she acquired from the vet clinic, and Tammy passed out. She then used a dog anesthetic on like a cloth, almost like chloroform, but it wasn't chloroform, to do this, to keep her sedated throughout the entire experience, because they were really afraid that she would wake up and they couldn't have her, be aware of what was happening. So she continued to sedate her throughout the entire experience. So while she was unconscious, Paul raped Tammy, and then Paul encouraged Karla to join in. So Karla joined in on sexually assaulting Tammy as well, and they both filmed the entire ordeal. Then when Tammy woke up, she began vomiting really, really heavily. She was choking on her own vomit, and so they actually had to call 911. So Tammy went off to the hospital, and when she arrived, they discovered that she actually had like chemical burns all over her face from the dog anesthetic. And because they had used so much anesthesia, because they hadn't measured anything, they didn't know the correct doses, and obviously what you give to an animal is very different to what you give to a human. They had just given her way too much, and unfortunately Tammy was pronounced dead. So obviously the chemical burns should have erased some sort of suspicion, but it didn't. They basically just fed them the story that she had drank too much and passed out and fallen on the carpet and blah, 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 blah. And so it was pronounced an accident. And this horrible, horrible incident is actually what kickstarted the couple's life of crime together, essentially. From this point on, they decided that that's exactly what they wanted to do with their lives. They both moved out together. They moved away from the family. They showed zero remorse for what had happened or for her death or losing her sister. Their power dynamic strengthened, which obviously was in the favor of Paul. Their goals aligned. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and that was to kill and rape women. And they even considered their sex life to have improved, because now Karla would dress up as Tammy, and she would role play as Tammy and pretend she was giving her virginity to Paul, and she would pretend just gross shit. They would role play the night that she had actually died, and the fact that that's her sister is just so wrong. So at this point, all of the Scarborough rapes had obviously stopped, all of the assaults had stopped, and now there was suddenly a huge spike in rape and sexual assaults in this new town, St. Catherine's. But for some reason, no one was able to connect those dots to Paul or to Karla, and so nothing came of it. On the 7th of June, Karla found their next victim, and it was actually a woman that she worked with. They did basically the same thing. They laced her drink, they sedated her, they raped and assaulted her, they filmed the entire thing, except this time when she woke up, she had no recollection of anything that happened. And so they basically said, oh, you passed out, we woke you up. Then she went about her life. She didn't know, she was none the wiser. She had no idea anything had happened. A couple of days later, and Paul found their next victim, this time 14-year-old Leslie. So Leslie had actually been out at a wake, but she had arrived home after curfew. It was around 2 a.m. So her parents had locked her out because she was too late, and they thought they would teach her a lesson. And so she was just sort of walking around. She was in her garden when Paul found her. So he and Karla held Leslie within their home for 24 hours, and they raped, assaulted, and tortured the poor girl. And then they ended up killing her after 24 hours because her blindfold had slipped off, and there's differing stories as to how she died. Paul always blamed Karla for the murder, saying that she had over-sedated her, although there's no evidence to prove that she was sedated at this time, because they had kidnapped her straight off the bat. They hadn't sedated her first. It wasn't like a secret, if that makes sense. And Karla claims that actually it was Paul who killed her. He strangled her to death because the blindfold had fallen off and they didn't want anyone to know that it was them. Anyway, they hid Leslie in their basement while they cleaned up, and then they actually had Karla's family come over for dinner while poor Leslie was dead in the basement. So they just acted like everything was fine, which is just a next level of crazy. And then when they left, they went downstairs and actually chopped Leslie's body into pieces using a saw. They then encased all of her body pieces in like big blocks of cement and then dropped those blocks of cement into Lake Gibson. 2 weeks after this, the couple actually get married, but on their wedding day, Leslie's body is found by a bunch of divers and her body is pulled out of the lake. Unfortunately, they're still unable to connect this to Paul though, and so it really had no effect on their wedding day at all. They really didn't care because it didn't seem like there was any consequence coming from it. Over the next year, Karla lured in several other women and did the same sort of thing where they would date them, abuse them, film them, and then just set them free. Unlike Tammy, all of these people would just wake up perfectly fine, not remembering a thing, and just go on home like nothing ever happened. So they obviously had gotten better at their dosages. On the 16th of April 1992, they found another victim in a church parking lot, and so they actually asked her to come over and give them directions, at which point they pulled her into the car and took them back to their house. This time though, the girl's parents called the police right away and reported her missing because she was actually walking home from school. So they were expecting her home and she just never showed up home. So everyone was looking for her like right off the bat, which hadn't happened previously. And straight away people came forward, witnesses came forward claiming that they saw the abduction. But the witness who saw the abduction was a woman. She wasn't really familiar with cars, and so she told the police and was very adamant that the perpetrator was driving a beige Camaro. And so the whole town was looking for a beige Camaro. They were up on billboards and everything. But unfortunately, the car that Paul actually drove was a gold Nissan. So very, very different. So the couple abuse, rape, and torture Kristen French for a couple of days, and they would just unnecessarily beat her and be very, very violent with her, which they hadn't previously done to this extent. They then strangled her to death and left her dead, naked body in a ditch about 30 miles away. At this point, the abuse towards Karla herself was actually really bad. It had intensified quite a lot, and she was being beaten almost every single day, really, really, really badly. And there was a few instances where she actually had to go to hospital because of how badly Paul had beaten her up. There was photos of her with really dramatic bruising all over her eyes and her face, and quite horrific attacks. But it wasn't until 1993 that Karla was finally convinced by her family that she needed to leave Paul. They had had quite a bad incident where he had beat her up and she had to visit the hospital and the police had to be involved. So at this time, finally, the DNA had been tested for the Scarborough rapist. Finally, they realized that Paul was in fact the Scarborough rapist. But that was a whole different investigation. They had no idea that this was actually linked to all these murders and all these new, rapes and attacks. And it wasn't until they actually got a tip that was basically like, you need to look at the Scarborough rapist and look at this case and connect the dots. And so finally they were able to connect the dots and realize that these two people were the culprits for both sets of crimes. So now police would visit Karla and question her over and over and over and over, and they pretended that they were questioning her about the domestic violence situation and trying to get Paul, in trouble for beating her up. But really they were trying to find out more information about all these other crimes, and they were trying to connect the dots. Unfortunately, Karla knew the detectives who came along to interrogate her, and she knew that they were there because of other reasons. They were very famous detectives. They were always seen on the TV, and she was aware of that. So as soon as she saw them, she knew that they knew. She knew something was up. And so as soon as they left, she actually broke down and confessed everything to her family. After this, she got a lawyer pretty much straight away. And so she immediately confessed to all of the murders. But what she didn't confess to is just how big of a part she actually played in the murders. Instead, what she did was try and pin everything on Paul and say that she was sort of dragged through the mud because she was stuck in this really horrific domestic violence situation, which it was a horrific domestic violence situation, but it was something that she willingly wanted to be a part of. She enjoyed the abuse because she was very masochistic. She enjoyed the abuse towards others as well, and she obviously had a very, very big part in all of these murders and rapes, but that's not The impression that she gave to police, she was very, very manipulative. And so she told police that she would only testify against Paul if they would lessen her sentence, which goes to show just how conniving she really was in this situation. She was really just out for herself, which is a completely different narrative to what the media sort of tried to portray. A lot of the time they tried to portray Karla as being more innocent and going along with it because she was in this horrible domestic violence situation and she was so in love with Paul. But if she was so in love with Paul, why would she throw him under the bus the first chance that she gets and lie to police about her involvement? Doesn't sound innocent to me, but anyway. So now they arrested Paul, but they were unable to find all these videotapes where they had obviously filmed all of these, you know, attacks and all of these rapes and all of this abuse. And that's what they really needed in order to put both him and Karla away for a very long time. And that's what they really, truly wanted. But it took them a very long time to find it. So Karla was charged with manslaughter for the death of Leslie and Kristen, and she wasn't formally charged for the death of Tammy at all. And Paul pleaded non guilty to all of his charges. I think there was about 9 charges, and that included first degree murder, 2 counts of first degree murder, rape and assault. After this, they finally found all of these tapes, and now they could see that Tammy actually played a much, much, much larger part in all of these attacks and murders than what she portrayed. But by now, the plea deal had already been finalized, and so there was nothing they could do. They couldn't raise her charges to anything higher than fucking manslaughter. Fucking manslaughter. For killing all these people, manslaughter. Oh, that makes me so mad. So despite there now being hard evidence that she had a very big role in these attacks, she stuck with manslaughter, and there was nothing they could do unless they wanted to fuck up the whole situation, and they just couldn't pursue it any further. So Paul was found guilty on all counts of murder and rape and assault and abuse, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And Karla, because of her plea deal, was only sentenced to 12 years in prison. She has since been released and had a fucking child. She has a son. How can you rape that many people and kill that many people, including your own flesh and blood, your sister, and still be promoted to have children? The fuck? So that is the story of the Barbie and Ken Killers. I really hope you enjoyed that one. This one makes me fucking angry, to be honest, but anyway. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to know what you think about Karla's plea deal. Do you think that it was fair that they pursued Paul more than they pursued her? Or do you think that they should have, once they found this information, like really gone in on her and tried to have the charges changed and did what they could? Let me know what you think about that, because that makes me so mad. And what do you think about what Karla did to her sister? Do you think that that is just as bad as any attack and murder that she did to all these other people? Or do you think that that makes it worse because they were blood related and they were supposed to be sisters? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, or you can head over to my Facebook, which is skyweb with 3 B's, and let me know there. I'd really love to know what you think about this. Make sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you feel like it. I would really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so that you can see all my new videos. I post every single Thursday all about true crime, and I'd love to have you be a part of it. Make sure you guys are being safe out there. Don't give anybody directions. Don't lock your kids out if they miss curfew, because it's fucking dangerous. And most importantly, never idolize your older sister's boyfriends, because they're all crazy, gross, and weird. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye!